For today's history video, let's talk about the New Deal. I'm going to analyze it in a couple of different phases, and in this first one, let's focus on the immediate issue of relief and recovery. Later we'll talk about reform in the New Deal, because it was largely successful in its reform policies and in its relief policies, but a disaster in its recovery policies. So let's talk about that. In terms of relief, there was really no system of state unemployment relief, and if there was, it was very minor and only in certain states. So that when you lost your job, you were just out. And the crash of the Great Depression is huge. The gross domestic product fell by literally 50%. It went from 100 billion to 50 billion between 1929 and 1933. Imagine it going from our current 15 trillion to 7 or 8 trillion in 4 years. This just absolutely was a fiasco. The unemployment rate, the real, that is the one that we have at 7.5 or 8.5%, was over 20%. In fact, the national average, I think, was 26% in 1933. So one of the good things that Roosevelt did was to set up a relief operation so people wouldn't starve to death. First, he set up the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. My mom taught school under Works Progress as a English teacher, taught English to foreigners, and millions of people were employed. And then he set up the Public Works Administration, PWA, that built the Hoover Dam and the East Side Drive in New York City and the Deegan Expressway and all kinds of public works projects all over the United States. And unlike the Obama Public Works, they were really well-conceived, well-executed, and needed. And they represented important improvements to the nation's infrastructure. He also adequately funded the unemployment relief programs throughout the country, and in 1936, paid the bonus to veterans that they were entitled to from their World War I service that wasn't supposed to be paid until the early 40s. But in the realm of recovery, the Roosevelt administration actions were ridiculous. And the myth that Roosevelt led the country out of the Depression is just that, a myth. The myth begins when people say that the banks were all closed when Roosevelt took office. Well, they were. They'd been closed for 2 weeks, largely, as we said in the last week's video, because of panic that Roosevelt was going to screw up the currency and inflate the currency and use silver instead of gold. And as a result, people ran to the banks to get their money out of the banks. See, in those days, a dollar bill could be redeemed for gold. At least 40% of it could be redeemed for gold. So people ran to get their savings out that they could then bring to the Treasury and get gold out. And that was because they were scared about the currency. The crisis itself was kindled when Henry Ford refused to bail out a bank in Detroit, and the whole thing escalated throughout the country. Roosevelt shut down the banks in a bank holiday and reopened them within the week, a plan that really had been conceived in the Hoover administration. Then he proceeded to deal with the economy, and his fundamental thought was that what was needed was inflation. There had previously been, in the Depression, a dramatic deflation, dropping of prices. So farmers were starving. They couldn't get decent prices for their products. It led to the Dust Bowl and the Okies moving to California. Industrial workers couldn't get decent wages. And even with the prices at rock bottom, nobody had the money to pay for it. So he set up a cartel system. It was basically a fascist model, and by that I don't mean authoritarian or racist or any of the Hitler stuff. It was what Mussolini had set up, which is all the coal companies, all the steel companies, all of the sugar companies, all the other companies worked together in an industry, vertically integrated, to fix the prices, so nobody could charge a price lower than a certain fixed amount. It was called the National Recovery Administration. And if people agreed to the price-fixing codes, they would put a Blue Eagle in their store window. And everybody was supposed to only shop at Blue Eagle stores, even though you could get the same thing a lot cheaper around the corner. at somebody that wasn't part of the NRA, and it became a total administrative nightmare. It involved controlling prices in over 700 different commodities. The bureaucracy fell all over itself. The price levels were sometimes ridiculously high or low, and the Supreme Court put Roosevelt out of his misery by declaring it unconstitutional. He did, to his credit, set up the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. That was the first time we subsidized farm prices and said they're not going to fall lower than a certain level, which granted some measure of relief to the farm community. But the basic point is that the reason the economy began to move out of the Great Depression was simply because the capitalist economy recovered. It had begun to move out at the end of the Hoover administration, and in 1932 posted enormous growth. Then it crashed again with the banks, and then in 33, 34, 35, and into 36, it gradually recovered, and the unemployment rate dropped from 26% in 1933 to 13% in 1936. That inaugurated, and starting in 34 and 35, a whole new era of reform, where Roosevelt changed fundamentally the whole nature of the governance relationship with the American people. We'll talk about that in our next video. And then the video after that, we'll talk about how it all went to hell when a depression returned in 1936 that Roosevelt couldn't solve. So we'll talk about all that over the next 2 weeks. Thanks for watching.